Max was a naughty child, wild and relentless, always testing limits, always too much for his mother to handle. From the moment his eyes snapped open in the morning, the house was his playground. His mother Sophie was just trying to keep up. There was no stillness with him, no quiet, only the constant thrum of chaos creeping into every corner of their small home. This morning she woke to the sound of something shattering. Stumbling into the kitchen, she found Max crouched on the counter, his pyjamas rumpled, his small hands sticky with spilt juice, a broken glass glinting on the floor beneath him. Crumbs clung to his shirt, a smear of something dark streaked across his cheek. He grinned at her, his teeth small and white, his fingers twitching with restless energy. She didn't have the strength to scold him, not today. With a slow breath she bent to clean up the mess, the sharp scent of oranges and something metallic curling in the air. Max didn't move, he just sat there, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. Some days Sophie swore he did these things on purpose, not just childish mischief, but something else, something deeper. The way he pushed and pushed, always wanting to see how far he could go. The way his laughter never quite matched the look in his eyes. And the worst part was the feeling, deep in her chest, that he knew exactly what he was doing. There had always been something different about Max. Even as a baby, he never cried the way the children did. His gaze had been too steady, too focused, as if he understood more than he should. As he grew, his mischief became more than just carelessness. It was deliberate, calculated. He would stare at her after making a mess, waiting, always waiting. Sophie had tried to explain it away, blaming exhaustion, stress, anything but the creeping unease that prickled on the back of her neck. But the signs were everywhere. The way he seemed to know when she was at her weakest, choosing the moments to push her just a little further. The way he never flinched, never looked guilty, never truly seemed sorry. She finished cleaning the floor, tossing the glass shards into the bin, her hands shaking. When she looked up, Max was still there, still watching, his head tilted slightly, just enough to make her stomach twist. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but before she could speak, he slid off the counter, landing with unnatural grace. He walked past her, dragging his fingers along the table's surface, smearing juice in slow, deliberate streaks. The day had hardly begun, and already Sophie felt drained. Outside, the sky was a dull, washed-out grey, pressing down against the house like a heavy hand. She glanced at the clock. Hours to go before bedtime. Hours to go before she could breathe again. Max turned back once before leaving the kitchen, a knowing little smirk tugging at his lips. Sophie exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. It was going to be another long day. Max had always been a handful, but lately it had become too much for Sophie to handle. His constant mischief, his unrelenting energy, and the way he seemed to push every limit without hesitation had worn her thin. The small messes, the endless noise, the endless questions, it all added up, day after day, until Sophie felt like she was barely holding on. No matter how many times she tried to calm him, to reason with him, it felt like he never listened. It wasn't just the usual child's behaviour, it was something deeper, something in the way he looked at her sometimes, like he knew exactly what he was doing, and it unsettled her. She couldn't get away from it. He was always there, always demanding, always needing, and even when he wasn't speaking, she could feel his presence, as if he was watching her every move, waiting for her to break. One evening after a particularly exhausting day, Sophie felt she was running on empty. She had tried to manage everything, keeping the house clean, keeping up with work, dealing with Max, but something in her had snapped. The weight of it all pressed down too hard. She couldn't remember the last time she'd ever felt peace, and the thought of another day of constant chaos felt suffocating. That's when she called her sister. Laura answered, surprised by the urgency in Sophie's voice. Sophie had never asked for help before, not like this, but today she couldn't pretend she could handle it all on her own any longer. She needed a break, she needed space, she needed Max to stay with Laura for a few days. Her sister hesitated at first, sensing something was wrong, but she agreed. The next morning Sophie packed Max's bag in silence. She grabbed clothes, toys and his favourite stuffed animal, trying to force herself to stay calm. Max, as always, was silent too. He didn't protest, didn't ask why. He simply let her dress him, let her zip up his coat. He just stood there, watching her, as if he knew exactly what was happening. As Max climbed into the car, he didn't look back, he didn't wave, he didn't say goodbye. He simply sat there staring straight ahead, as if this was just another ordinary day. Sophie watched as the car drove off, its taillights fading into the distance. The house was eerily quiet, and for the first time in years, Sophie realised she had the space to breathe. But instead of feeling relief, she was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Something didn't feel right. Max was gone, but it didn't feel like he had left. At first it was just a damp patch, a small dark stain spreading across the living room wall. Sophie noticed it the day after Max left. Running her fingers over the cool surface, the plaster felt solid, dry despite discoloration. She checked the pipes, the roof, anywhere water could be seeping in, but there were no leaks. By the next morning the patch had doubled in size. Another appeared in the hallway, a faint trickle creeping down towards the floorboards. The kitchen smelt damp, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. She turned off the taps, checked under the sink. Nothing. It didn't make sense. Then the water began to spread. Dark veins of moisture bled through the wallpaper. Small beads of water gathered on the ceiling like condensation, too much to be normal. The floorboards in the bedroom were damp under her feet, leaving her socks cold and wet. Sophie tried everything, calling the landlord, checking the pipes again, opening windows to air out the house, but nothing stopped it. And worse, it was getting faster. By the third night, water dripped steadily from the ceiling, soaking into the carpets, seeping into the wall. It wasn't just one place anymore, it was everywhere. She stood in the middle of the living room, heart pounding as droplets ran down on the walls, in thin, glistening streams. The light flickered, the damp air buzzing with something she couldn't name. It was impossible. Water didn't come from nowhere, and yet it was coming from everywhere. The next morning Sophie called a plumber. She had barely slept, listening to the steady drip of water echoing through the house. When he arrived, he walked through each room, running his hand along the damp walls, his frown deepening as he worked. He checked everything, the pipes under the sink, the connections, behind the washing machine, the plumbing inside the bathroom walls. There were no leaks, no burst pipes, nothing to explain the spreading water. Yet it was there, creeping steadily across every surface, impossible to ignore. Perplexed, he pried up a section of the floorboards in the hallway. The wood was damp and swollen, but beneath it the ground was dry. In the attic the insulation was untouched, the roof showing no signs of damage. As a final test, he turned off the hot water supply completely. Still the water continued to seep from the walls, the ceiling, even the floors, as if the house itself was sweating. This wasn't plumbing, this was something else. He packed up his tools and left. Sophie stood in the silent, dripping house, the dampness pressing in from all sides. The water had no source, and it was only getting worse. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding, the damp air pressing against her like a heavy weight. The house was silent except for the dripping. Slow, steady, endless. It came from every direction, from the walls, the ceiling, the very floor beneath her. She could feel it spreading, creeping into every surface, as if the house itself was drowning. She couldn't stay here like this. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone, barely able to steady her breathing as she scrolled to Laura's number. The moment her sister answered, Sophie let the words spill out. Something was wrong. Something was really wrong. The water was everywhere, coming from nowhere, impossible to stop. The plumber had found nothing, but it would not go away. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Laura hesitated, trying to reason with her. Maybe it was condensation. Maybe something had been overlooked. But there was no doubt in her voice. Sophie could hear it. When Laura called for Max, and the phone rustled as she passed it to him. His voice was light, casual, completely unaffected. He told her about his breakfast, about cartoons, about a game he had played. Normal, simple, nothing unusual. As he spoke, the air in the room shifted. The heaviness began to lift. The thick scent of damp wood and stagnant water faded, replaced by nothing at all. The mist which had curled into the corners of the hallway dissolved. The dripping slowed. Sophie sat frozen, barely able to breathe. She strained her ears, waiting for the next drop to fall, but there was nothing. She stood slowly, stepping out into the hallway. The dark streaks of moisture that had been spreading along the walls were disappearing, shrinking, fading into dry plaster. The wall, which had been cold and slick with dampness, was smooth and warm beneath her feet. Even the ceiling, where the water had gathered in glistening beads, was untouched. By the time Max finished speaking, the house was dry. Sophie sat down, phone still in hand, staring at the space where the water stains had been. The next day, Laura brought Max home. He stepped inside, clutching his stuffed animal, looking around as if nothing had changed, and the house stayed dry. The first few days after Max came home were peaceful. He was unusually well behaved, playing quietly in his room, eating his meals without fuss, even helping Sophie tidy up without being asked. The house remained dry, the walls smooth and untouched, as if none of it had ever happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie allowed herself to breathe, but it didn't last. By the end of the week, Max started slipping back into his old habits. He became restless, knocking things over, drawing on the walls when he thought she wasn't looking. He refused to go to bed on time, running through the house at night, his laughter echoing down the hallways. Sophie tried to stay patient, but the exhaustion returned quickly, pressing down on her like before. One evening, after yet another tantrum, Sophie finally snapped. She shouted, her voice sharp and raw, the frustration pouring out before she could stop it. Max stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment the house felt too quiet. Sophie turned away, heart still racing, and went to the kitchen. She needed a moment, needed to breathe. The dishes from dinner sat in the sink, so she reached for the tap, turning the handle to cold. The moment the water touched her skin, pain shot through her fingers. She yanked her hands back, gasping. Red splotches bloomed across her palms, skin stinging as if she had dipped them into boiling water. The tap was still running, the stream clear and inviting. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out again, letting just the tip of her finger brush against it. Burning. Her breath hitched. The tap was on cold. She could see it was turned to cold, but the water was impossibly, blisteringly hot. Heart pounding, she turned the handle back and forth, switching between hot and cold, but it made no difference. The scalding water kept pouring, clear and unbothered, as if mocking her. Sophie turned off the tap, gripping the edge of the sink, the pain in her hands throbbing. The water had changed, and deep down she knew this wasn't over. Later that evening, Sophie decided to take a bath. Hoping for a few moments of peace, she ran warm water into the tub, letting the steam fill the room, easing some of the tension in her body. She sank into the water, letting its warmth soak into her skin, trying to let go of everything that had been weighing on her. For the first time in days, she felt a small sense of calm. But then, the sound of small fists banging on the bathroom door broke through the silence. Max was calling for her, whining, needing attention. Sophie sighed, pressing her palms over her eyes, wishing for just a little peace, but the banging continued, louder this time, desperate. Max called out again, his voice rising with impatience, complaining he was bored and wanted her to come out. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the relentless pounding on the door only grew louder. She sank deeper into the tub, the water barely comforting her anymore, and she clenched her teeth in frustration. Finally she had enough. She turned towards the door, her irritation bubbling over. She shouted, her voice sharp and filled with tension, demanding Max go play in his room. For a moment the house was silent. Sophie let out a breath, trying to regain control of her nerves. She turned back towards the water, but the frustration was still there, gnawing at her. The tension wouldn't leave her body. She submerged herself in the tub, hoping to ease the knot in her stomach. For a few seconds she allowed herself to sink under the water, but as soon as she did, something felt wrong. The water was different, thicker, heavier. It seemed to hold her down, pressing against her. The sensation was suffocating, unnatural. She tried to push herself back up, but it was as if something invisible was pulling her deeper, keeping her under. Panic gripped her chest as she gasped for air, but instead the water pushed into her mouth, choking her, filling her lungs. Her body reacted instinctively, coughing and gasping for breath. She thought to break free. Her hands scrambled for the sides of the tub, pulling herself up. Finally she surfaced, her chest heaving as she sucked in air. The bathroom was silent once again, but something felt off. The water no longer felt warm and comforting. It felt oppressive, as if it was trying to consume her. Sophie quickly climbed out of the tub, her feet slipping on wet tiles. She wrapped herself in a towel, her hands shaking. The sensation of the water clung to her skin, as if it had marked her. Max's voice came again from the other side of the door, but Sophie didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far deeper than the water itself. The house had changed, and she wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew it wasn't over. The next morning everything felt normal. Max sat in the living room, surrounded by his toys, completely absorbed in whatever game he had created. The house was quiet, no dripping, no damp air, no strange heaviness pressing down on her. Sophie tried to convince herself that the night before had been nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. Max had barely stepped outside since coming home, spending his days tucked away indoors. Sophie told herself it wasn't good for him. He needed fresh air. He needed to run around, to burn off the restless energy that had always built up inside of him. When she told him they were going to the park, he refused, shaking his head, tightening his grip on the toy in his hands. She insisted, pulling him away from his game. He whined and dragged his feet the whole way, but Sophie ignored it. He needed to be outside, and she needed to feel like things were normal again. At the park, the children played, their laughter ringing through the crisp afternoon air. But Max was sullen, kicking at the dirt instead of joining them. Sophie watched him from a distance, arms crossed, frustration curling in her stomach. She tried to be patient, but it was like he was determined to fight her on everything. When he started throwing wood chips from the playground floor, she called for him to stop. He ignored her. She sighed, tired of the battle, and decided it was time to leave. As they walked home, Max ran ahead, his small figure darting down the path. Sophie called after him, telling him to slow down, to wait. He didn't listen. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. The first drops of rain splattered against the pavement, cool and sudden. Within seconds, the drizzle turned into a steady downpour. Sophie quickened her pace. The rain became heavier, harder, pounding against her skin. The wind picked up, rushing through the trees, making the branches groan. Water streamed down the path, soaking into the ground too fast to be absorbed. Max was still ahead, running, his small figure blurred in the sheets of rain. And then he was out of sight. Sophie tried to call for him again, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. The rain kept coming, harder and harder, as if the sky itself had burst open. Sophie's heart pounded as she ran forward, the rain hammering down so hard it blurred her vision. Max had been ahead of her, but now she couldn't see him. Panic rose in her chest, cold and sharp, as she pushed through the downpour, calling his name even though the storm drowned out her voice. Then suddenly she saw him. He was standing at the front door of the house, his back to her, perfectly still. The way he stood, unmoving, shoulders squared, it made something cold slither through her spine. He wasn't fumbling for the handle or calling for her to hurry. He was just waiting. She rushed forward, breathless, drenched from head to toe. She called his name. Again her voice was laced with fear and frustration, but he didn't turn. He didn't react at all. Reaching the door, she fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, rainwater dripping from her fingers. She pushed the door open, nudging Max inside, ushering him in quickly before stepping in after him. The moment they crossed the threshold, it was as if the world outside shifted. The rain almost stopped instantly. 1 second the storm had been an unforgivable torrent, roaring in her ears, soaking her to the bone. The next, silence. Not even a soft drizzle remained. Through the window she could see that the street was already beginning to dry, the storm vanishing as if it had never happened, her hands trembling as she locked the door. Sophie told herself she was being ridiculous. Rainstorms ended suddenly all the time. Children got distracted. She was just exhausted, overworked, and letting her mind get carried away. But as she looked at Max, still standing in the entryway, quiet, watching her with that unreadable expression, she felt something shift deeply inside her. She couldn't keep brushing this off. Her body was tense with an unease she couldn't shake. The water, the mist, the bath, the way Max had just stood there in the rain, it was too much. But she didn't want to push him now. She told herself she just needed to rest, needed to clear her mind, needed to stop annoying Max, stop making a fuss. If she let things settle, everything would go back to normal. At least that's what she'd hoped. As the days passed, Sophie found herself treading more and more carefully around Max. It wasn't that he was doing anything particularly unusual. He was always a handful, always pushing boundaries, but something about the way he did it now made her stomach knot. It was the way he watched her, the way he tested her, as if he knew she was too drained to fight back. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things. She was overtired, overwhelmed. After everything that had happened, she was just on edge, that was all. But Max was restless. He started small, tapping his spoon against the table long after she had asked him to stop, dragging his toys across the floor, plastic scraping against the wood, the sound digging into her skull, scattering his crayons, watching as she gathered them up, only to do it again. Little things that shouldn't have mattered so much, but the repetition wore her down. She didn't scold him, she didn't even tell him to stop. She was too exhausted. Then he got bolder. He knocked over a cup, letting the liquid spread across the table. She quickly wiped it up, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. He pulled the books from the shelf, letting them fall into a messy heap. Her hands trembled as she stacked them back into place. She wasn't afraid of him. That would be ridiculous. He was just a child. But she didn't want to push him. He moved through the house like a shadow, always just a few steps ahead of her, always watching. One afternoon, he trailed his fingers across the walls, leaving smudges she knew she would have to clean later. He slammed doors as he passed, the noise making her flinch every time. When he yanked at the curtains hard enough to strain the fabric, she opened her mouth to tell him to stop, but no words came out. Instead, she swallowed it down, pressed her lips together and turned away. Then with deliberate slowness, he walked into the cabinet, reached for a picture frame, lifted it slightly, just enough for her to notice. She broke. The weight of it all pressed down at once, her breath shuddering, her hands covering her face as tears welled in her eyes. She had been holding everything in for too long, and now it came spilling out in uneven sobs. For the first time all week, Max was still. He didn't drop the frame. He didn't knock anything else over. He just stood there, watching. Then, as if nothing had happened, he set the frame back down and walked away. Sophie stayed where she was, trembling, trying to steady her breath. She told herself it was just a bad day, just exhaustion, just a child testing his mother's patience, even though her instincts told her otherwise. Later in the week they went for a walk during the day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the damp pavement. Max's mother walked with a wary stiffness, her eyes darting behind them every so often. She had noticed him, the man, the same shadow that had followed them before. Max, however, didn't seem to notice. He hummed to himself softly, kicking at stray pedals along the path, lost in his own world. If he sensed anything, he gave no sign. The boy walked fast, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly, his sneakers slapped against the pavement. His breath shallow and quick. The air was thick with a scent of damp concrete, a storm having passed earlier that evening, leaving the world slick and glistening. His mother glanced behind them again, her face drawn tight with worry. He could feel it. Even if she said nothing, he could feel the presence too. The man, shadowed and silent, was still there, always a dozen steps behind, never falling back, never moving closer. The boy didn't know why he was following them, but he knew deep in his chest that the man meant them harm. The rainwater pooled in the gutters, tiny rivulets snaking around the storm drains. The boy watched the water trickle and shift, but his attention remained on the mother's tightening grip. She was walking faster now, her breath uneven. Almost there, his mother murmured, squeezing his hand, but the boy knew they weren't. Not yet. Ahead the street narrowed, where the construction had left piles of rubble and rusted pipes stacked against the curb. A flickering orange traffic cone cast a dim glow on the broken pavement. A water main ran along the sidewalk, a thick pipe jutting from the ground where a section had been patched together hastily. It seemed glistening with moisture from the storm. The man behind them walked on, his boots heavy and deliberate. Max barely noticed as they passed the water main, his focus on the way his mother pulled at his hand. Her movements more urgent. Then it happened. The water main exploded. A deafening crack split the air as metal buckled and ruptured. A geyser of water shot forward, drenching everything within reach. The man barely had time to turn before the flood hit him, a wave crashing against his chest, lifting him off his feet. His arm flailed wildly as he was thrown backwards, his body twisting as he tumbled through the air, before slamming into the side of a parked car with a sickening thud. Max flinched, his eyes wide as water drained down in heavy sheets, soaking the pavement, gushing in torrents towards the drains. The man, now a motionless heap on the ground, steam rising from the shattered main as the pressure slowly eased. His mother's grip tightened painfully. She didn't speak, didn't move for a moment. Her breath came fast and shallow. Then with a yank she pulled him forward. "Come on," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. He followed, his legs shaking. They ran. Behind them the man groaned, shifting slightly where he lay, but Max didn't turn back. He couldn't. His mother's grip never loosened, her pace never slowed. There was something in the way she held him now, a trembling uncertainty. She didn't say anything, but he could feel her fear. And not for the first time, it wasn't just the man she was afraid of. They paused briefly. Sophie stole a glance at her son as they hurried down the street. Her breath hitched. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't panicked like she was. He was looking back at the injured man, watching him with an unsettling stillness. His expression wasn't blank, but it wasn't filled with fear or shock either. It was something else, something unreadable. He should have been terrified. A child his age should have been clinging to her, asking if the man was dead, if they were in trouble. But Max simply watched. The cold realization settled in her chest like a stone. His eyes weren't wide with fear or brimming with tears like they should have been. Instead they were steady, almost assessing. There was no flicker of guilt or horror, no relief that they had escaped, just a quiet, unnerving acceptance, as though he had expected this outcome all along. A shiver crawled up her spine. The way the water main had burst, it was so sudden, so forceful, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment the man stepped near it, and Max standing so close, completely still. It made no sense, but she couldn't shake the thought that crept into her mind, unbidden and impossible. It was like he had something to do with it. God knows how, but he did. Her fingers dug into his wrist as she pulled him along. He barely reacted. He just kept walking, silent, steady, his face betraying nothing. His small frame did not tremble. He did not stumble or look back again. He moved with the same quiet resolve as before, as if none of it had unsettled him at all. Sophie's breath grew ragged. The wind blew through her soaked clothes, but it wasn't the cold making her shiver. The rational part of her mind told her that this was ridiculous. It was just a coincidence, a freak accident. Pipes burst all the time. It had nothing to do with Max. It couldn't have. And yet... Her pulse pounded in her ears as they hurried forward, putting more distance between them and the wreckage. The urge to ask him, to demand an explanation, burned inside her, but the words stayed lodged in her throat. She was too afraid to say them, too afraid of what his answer might be. She forced her feet forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, gripping his wrist tighter than she needed to. It was an accident. It had to be. But no matter how much she told herself that, the feeling wouldn't leave her. Sophie found herself hesitating more often now. She kept him close, rarely letting him stray too far. But there was something else, a reluctance she didn't quite understand. She should have been desperate for space, for a moment to breathe, yet the thought of sending him off to school or to a friend's house left a sick feeling in her stomach. What if something happened? What if she wasn't there to see it, to stop it? Max was restless, acting out more than usual. He tested her patience, pushing her boundary, but she let things slide. He could sense her uncertainty, that much she knew. He had always been perceptive, too much for his age, and yet despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just dangerous. He was something else, something protective in his own way. Maybe if left to his own devices he wasn't a threat at all. Maybe, just maybe, he was something like a guardian. A few days later Danny had been on his best behaviour, following the rules and listening well. But that evening, just as the sun was setting and the house settled into a quiet rhythm, he did something a little naughty. It wasn't anything major, but it was just enough to catch his mother off guard. She didn't raise her voice or scold him like she might have in the past. Instead she took a different approach. Quietly, without a word, she picked up his toys and carried them to the other room. She motioned for him to go and play over there. Danny didn't protest. He simply toddled off to the new place she had chosen for him, oblivious to the subtle shift in his routine. His mother watched him go silently, hoping that this quiet action would teach him a lesson without a confrontation. She sat back down, picked up a book and tried to focus, but something strange began to happen. At first it was just a small sound, barely noticeable. A soft rhythmic drip. It was as if someone was slowly dripping water somewhere in the house. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for the source of the sound. She checked the windows, the pipes, the ceiling, but there was nothing. The noise was faint, almost like the dripping of a leaky faucet, but she couldn't locate where it was coming from. It wasn't in the kitchen, not in the bathroom, nothing out of the ordinary. She returned to her book, trying to ignore it, but the sound continued, growing more and more persistent. It was the kind of sound that seemed to fill the room with a sense of maddening repetition. Her dripping came in intervals, soft but undeniably there, like the kind of water torture you read about in stories, a slow unending rhythm that makes you question your sanity. Danny was playing contentedly in the other room, unaware of the strange sound that seemed to be driving her mad. She felt the growing pressure in her mind, the irrationality of it all. She stood up, pacing, checking the windows again, listening to the floorboards creak beneath her feet. Where was the sound coming from? After what felt like an eternity, she finally walked over to the door where the room Danny was playing. She opened it, and just as she did, the dripping sound stopped. Silence. The relief was almost immediate, but it left her feeling even more confused. She stared at Danny, who looked up from his toys, his face filled with innocent curiosity. She closed the door behind her and sat down, a strange feeling washing over her. She thought about telling someone, but the thought of explaining that she had heard a strange, unexplainable dripping noise that only stopped when Danny came back into the room seemed too absurd. People would think she was crazy, so she kept it to herself, silently wondering if she had imagined it. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, or maybe it was something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to face. She couldn't say for sure, but whatever it was, it had stopped, and Danny was back in his usual routine. She told herself it didn't matter, that everything was fine. As the years passed by, life continued its steady march forward. The strange occurrences that had once seemed isolated began to weave themselves into the fabric of her daily life. At first they were easy enough to ignore, small, unexplainable moments, like the objects moving on their own, shadows that lingered too long in corners, and strange, cold spots that appeared in certain rooms, especially when she was alone. But over time they became harder to dismiss. It was as if there was an unseen presence in the house, one that seemed to grow more insistent with each passing year. Despite the oddities, she reached a kind of stasis with Max. The connection between them had evolved, becoming more complex as the years went by. It was like he wanted to be near her, to protect her, but it wasn't unconditional. There were strings attached, subtle but unmistakable. It felt as though things had to be on his terms, as if his presence in her life was a constant negotiation. He would appear at moments of emotional vulnerability, almost like a guardian, but his presence was never completely comforting. There was always a tension, an unspoken rule that things couldn't be forced. His influence was both comforting and unsettling. As Danny grew older, the strange occurrences seemed to follow him too, though they were never quite as intense. He had grown up with a quiet understanding that things weren't always as they seemed. But life, with its challenges and changes, took him down a different path, and he moved away for college, then into adulthood, carving out a life for himself. She continued to live in the house, which felt both familiar and strange in equal measure. Max's presence remained, though it became quieter, more distant over time. It was almost like he had settled into the background, a constant hum that never quite faded away, but no longer demanded attention. Then, 20 years later, Max came to visit. He had never really left, not in the way that people leave, but now, older, and with the weight of 2 decades between them, he stepped back into her life like a familiar but distant figure. It was almost as though time had not passed at all. He still lived nearby, but he had been living his own life, tied to his own routines and responsibilities. When he arrived at the door, it felt like something both simple and profound. They had shared so many years, so many quiet moments, yet now they were different people. The boy who had been so mysteriously attached to her was now a man, but the connection still held. Fragile and unspoken, like a thread stretching over the years. They sat down together, reminiscing about the past. They spoke about the oddities that had once filled their home, as if it were a story, something that was part of their shared history. It was easy to smile and laugh at their memories now, to look back with fondness at the peculiar moments that had once unsettled her. Max seemed comfortable, content even, to be with her once more, and the room felt warm with the weight of their shared experiences. Yet despite the laughter and lightness in the air, something lingered beneath the surface, an unspoken understanding that the strange things, the unexplained moments, had never truly gone away, but they had simply learned to live with them, as they had learned to live with Max's enigmatic presence. Time had passed, but the past had not left them behind. It was as if he was tethered to her in some inexplicable way, protective, yet always on his own terms. They had reached a sort of unspoken understanding. There were things that couldn't be mentioned, certain subjects that would never be brought up. But on this visit, as they sat together reminiscing old times, the conversation naturally drifted towards their old neighbour, Mr. Wright. Sophie had never been particularly fond of him, and Max even less so. The man had always caused trouble, always lingered in the background with an unsettling presence. Over the years his behaviour had become more erratic, and the tension in the air whenever he was around was palpable. Max seemed to grow agitated as he spoke about him, his jaw tightening, as though the years hadn't softened his disdain for the man. Sophie shifted uneasily in her seat. She could feel the weight of his words before they even left his mouth. There were things Max didn't know about Mr. Wright, things that Sophie had buried deep in her mind, locked away and never spoken of. He had never been there, never seen the moments that had made the house feel like a trap, never understood the way the air would thicken with unease when Mr. Wright was near. Still, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Max understood more than he let on. As they talked, with a smirk, Max suddenly brought up the way Mr. Wright had died. Sophie froze, the words cutting through her like a blade. They had all heard about it. Mr. Wright's body had been discovered near the river, a grim scene that left the town in shock. Drowned, they said, but the circumstances surrounding his death were anything but ordinary. His body had been contorted, in a way that seemed impossible for someone to have done to themselves. His neck was broken, as if someone had forced his head under the water, but there were no footprints in the mud, no sign of anyone else having been there. The scene had been eerily clean, with no trace of anyone's presence. It was as if the river itself had swallowed him whole, and then spat him back out, leaving no evidence of who or what had caused his death. Max's voice was quiet as he recounted the details, as if he were trying to piece together the mystery. There were no footprints, he said, no DNA, no sign that anyone had ever been there with him. It didn't make sense. Sophie's stomach twisted, and the room seemed to grow heavier. It was too much to bear. The weight of the words, the implications behind them. She had spent so many years trying to forget, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that something had been wrong. Something had shifted in the fabric of their lives that night. She had never spoken of it, never let herself think too hard about what had happened. And yet there was Max bringing it all back to the surface, his words like a key unlocking something she wasn't ready to confront. She wanted to tell him to stop, to shut down the conversation before it went any further, but her voice caught in her throat, the words unable to form. She just sat there, her heart racing, as the memory of strange events surrounding Mr. Wright's death hovered in the air. Max continued, quite aware of the weight of his words. Sophie trying to hold herself together, a forced smile, hoping to push the conversation into safer waters, but the unease had settled in, thick and oppressive. She knew that something had happened that night, something no one had ever truly understood, something she could never fully escape from. It was all tied together, somehow, and now in this quiet room with Max, it felt as though the past was clawing its way back to the surface, and the stomach-churning dynamic that she knew existed between herself and her son for years, wherein she knew she couldn't excessively provoke him and had to pacify him by letting him say or do whatever he needed to say or do, and they certainly didn't ease the tension. She looked down, away from him, her hands tightening in her lap. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She hadn't wanted to cry, hadn't wanted to let him see that his words had touched something raw, something she had spent years burying. The silence stretched between them, just like all those years ago when he had been a child and had pushed too far, when she had wept and he had for once fallen quiet. He did the same now. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his presence still and waiting, She could feel his eyes on her, searching, maybe even understanding in some way she couldn't explain. But he didn't press further. He didn't ask. He didn't insist. He just stopped. The tension in the room didn't lift, but it settled, thick and unspoken. The past had crept too close, brushing against them both, but neither would give it a name. Sophie wiped her face and exhaled slowly. Max leaned back, saying nothing. The moment had passed, but the weight of it remained. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Some things had already been understood. Sophie's thoughts slipped back through the years, like water flowing in reverse. She didn't speak, didn't tell Max where her mind had gone. Instead, the memories unfolded quietly, wordless images playing behind her eyes. She had been young, reckless, and the way that youth allows, believing in small magics, in rituals whispered between friends. There had been a girl she couldn't stand, someone cruel, someone who had hurt her in ways that left invisible bruises. And so in a moment of childish spite, she had done something foolish. She remembered the night air, the way the water had lapped the wooden beams of the old pier. She had made something, a crude, water-based voodoo charm, crafted with intent she barely understood, a bundle of twigs, thread and hair, tied with whispered resentment. She had dropped it into the dark water, watching it vanish beneath the surface. Expecting what? That something could happen? That fate would listen? Nothing did. The days passed, then months, then years. Life moved on, and she forgot. And yet that girl, the one she had cursed with her childish anger, died unexpectedly a few years later. A strange accident. Nothing seemed that unnatural at the time. Sophie hadn't even connected the two events. She had let it slip from her memory, convinced that it had been nothing but a meaningless ritual, a game played in the dark. But now, after all these years, with everything that happened, Max's presence in her life, the way things always seemed to shift in ways she couldn't explain, something cold settled in her stomach. Had she done this to herself? Had she set something in motion all those years ago? She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Sophie sat frozen in thought, her mind unravelling the past, pulling at threads she hadn't touched in years. The memory of that night at the pier felt distant, like something had happened to another person, and in a way it had. She had been young, filled with a kind of restless emotion that had nowhere to go. She had believed in small magics, in whispered words and secret rituals, not because she thought they held real power, but because it felt good to believe in something. The girl, Carla, had been the source of so much quiet misery in Sophie's youth, the kind of person who smiled sweetly while twisting the knife in ways only she could see. Sophie had never told anyone, never fought back, but one night, when the hurt had been too much, she had decided to take matters into her own hands. She had gathered small things she thought might hold some essence of Carla, a bit of thread from her sweater, a hair she had found on a school desk. She tied them together with sticks and twine, wrapped them tight with whispered words. She had read somewhere that water carried intention, that to give something to the current was to let fate take over. And so, beneath the moonlight, she had walked to the end of the pier and let a small bundle slip from her fingers, watching it vanish beneath the dark water. She had expected nothing, and for years that's exactly what she got. Time had moved forward, Carla had left town, and Sophie had barely thought about her again, until the day she heard about her death. A freak accident, something no one saw coming. Shocking, tragic, but not unnatural, not in the way that raised questions. Sophie had felt a strange chill when she learned of it, but she had dismissed it. Coincidence, nothing more. Now, decades later, with Max sitting across from her, she felt the same chill again, creeping up her spine, but this time she couldn't shake it away. Had that moment, had that silly childish ritual been more than she ever understood? Had she unknowingly invited something into her life? The thought burrowed into her, deep and unrelenting, because it wasn't just Carla, it was everything. It was the way Max had always been there, always near, as though tied to her by something neither of them could explain. It was the way strange things had followed her, the way certain events had unfolded in ways that never quite made sense. It was the way that Mr. Right had died, contorted, unnatural, as if by an unseen force. She had believed she had left that night behind, that the things she had done as a girl had faded with time. But what if they hadn't? What if she had cursed herself without ever realising it? The evening stretched on, the conversation between Sophie and Max tapering into silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, brushing against the windows with a sound like hushed voices. Max sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, as if he too was lost in some distant thought. Sophie glanced at him, searching his face for something, anything, that might tell her what he was thinking. But his gaze was steady, distant, almost knowing. She swallowed, trying to push away the unease curling inside her. It was ridiculous. There was nothing to be afraid of. The past was the past. Still, when she blinked, she could see the dark water beneath the pier. The way it had swallowed the small charm all those years ago. She had barely even thought about it since then, but maybe she should have. Maybe it had never really gone away. Max stood, stretching as if the weight of the conversation no longer lingered in him in the way it did in her. He smiled, warm, familiar, the same as always, and yet Sophie felt something beneath it, something she couldn't quite name. "I should go," he said. "It's getting late." She nodded, standing as well, suddenly eager for him to leave, though she couldn't explain why. She walked him to the door and stepped outside. The cold night air swept between them. He turned back to her, pausing just a second too long, as if he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. Instead, he just looked at her, the way he always had, the way he had since he was a child, like he knew something she didn't. Then with a small nod he walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Sophie lingered in the doorway, watching until he was out of sight. The house behind her felt different now, quieter, heavier. She took a slow breath and stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. Somewhere in the distance water dripped, steady and deliberate. She turned, listening. It was probably nothing.